Good morning, and welcome back to the final exciting conclusion to our three-part study of early Christianity in China. And today we're going to talk about China's second wave of Syriac Christianity and a few Catholics, because the first Catholic missionaries will come in during the period we talk about today. I'd like to start by asking the question, I think it was last Sunday in the sermon, the pastor mentioned Paul as being the greatest missionary of all time, and we often say that, and it's probably true, though it's not actually stated that way in the Bible, so it could be up for discussion, but I think he would rank right up there as among the greatest missionaries. But can you think of other famous missionaries? We have a name? Francis Xavier, okay. He's one of the first great Jesuit missionaries who's especially famous for his work in the Far East, in Japan. Think Ireland, February. St. Patrick, he's known as the great missionary to Ireland. Dr. I presume? Livingston, yes. So David Livingstone in the middle of Africa, 19th century. Anybody else? Schweitzer, early 20th century.
William Carey.
William Carey, big name, one of the first missionaries to India. Very good, and also one of the people who wrote a little book that was really stimulating the great missionary century, the 19th century. Johannes Schmielhäuser. Now we're coming a little closer to home here. And we could add a few other names. Uplegger for among the Apaches, Wendlands and Schweppes in Africa. So we have our own group of people. One of my favorites, Gary Schrader in Hong Kong. But we have famous missionaries, and I hope that you add one to your repertoire of names that we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, and repeat after me. Lo Pen. A Lo Pen. A Lo Pen. He is the name mentioned on the stele of the man who arrived in 635 in China and started the first Christian church in China. His name that should still be revered. We told the story 2 weeks ago about his arrival and how these Syriac-speaking missionaries went from Iraq and Iran all the way down the Silk Road into China in the year 635. And how the church was then allowed by the Chinese government. The Chinese emperor officially issued an edict allowing them to preach anywhere in China. And then about how that big stele showed and talked about what happened in under the following emperors for the next 150 years. The stele itself was put up in 781, and the church had been in China for 150 years at that time and was continuing to grow. And then last week we talked specifically about what the stele and the other documents tell us about the wonderful message that they were preaching and how they struggled to put the Christian message into the Chinese language and Chinese concepts so the people could understand that. Today we're going to talk about the second wave of Syriac-speaking Christianity. So again, these missionaries came from the Syriac-speaking church. That was their normal liturgical language in the Middle East and across the Silk Road. But if there's a second wave, that meant that the first wave had to come to an end, and that happened in the year 845 through no fault of the church itself. But when the Emperor Wuzong came along, the Chinese economy was tottering. The Tang Dynasty itself had been weakened considerably. A lot of economic issues, and what happens when the government has economic issues? They try to shore things up by looking around for money and to add to the tax rolls. And the big problem at that time was not Christians, but Buddhists. Buddhism, another foreign religion, had come into China early in the first millennium AD. And during the Tang Dynasty, it really blossomed and become more Chinese. Christianity was always probably considered one of the foreign religions. At least the government looked at it that way. Buddhism was also a foreign religion that had come in, but it was very adaptable. The Buddhists could basically adopt and add some of the old Chinese gods and legends right into their culture. And if today you go to Taiwan or Hong Kong or mainland China and go into a Chinese temple, or actually go to a Chinatown in New York City or San Francisco, and you'll see a Chinese temple there and go in, you probably can't, as an outsider, determine if this is a traditional Chinese temple with Chinese gods, or if it's a Taoist temple, or if it's a Buddhist temple, because they all look pretty much the same and they do pretty much the same thing, because Buddhism adapted itself to Chinese culture and just became part of the landscape. Well, that was a problem because anytime, if you're a Buddhist and you want to, you can become a Buddhist monk, basically by just making that declaration and putting on different clothes, etc. And once that happens, guess what? You don't have to pay taxes anymore. And if you donate land to the Buddhist church, that land goes off the tax rolls as well. Well, by this time, there's tens of thousands of Buddhist monks, and so the Emperor Wuzong says, this can't go on, we got to get these people back on the tax rolls. So he says, monks and nuns have been placed under the jurisdiction of the Director of Foreigners to make it perfectly clear that this Buddhism is a foreign religion, and we need to downgrade the people. So thousands of people were forced out or back into lay life who claimed to be Buddhist monks. Many of the Buddhist shrines were shuttered and the land seized by the government. But as a result, they weren't going to do this just to the Buddhists. They outlawed all the foreign religions. And so the Jingzhou, the Christian presence, also got caught in the crossfire. Finally, we have ordered more than 2,000 people of the Daqin, and if you remember, Daqin is on the top of the stele, means that big empire to the west, and was the name specifically used of the Christians, and the Zoroastrian religion, which was another Persian religion. These, and the third one was Manichaeism. All of those were also outlawed. And the 2,000 people to return to lay life and to stop polluting the customs of China. So this decree came out in 845 and basically outlawed Christianity as a public religion in China. If you remember, Alopen arrived in 635, so just over 200 years Christianity was allowed to grow and spread in China before this edict came out. And as far as we know, Christianity seems to have disappeared. The temples that were, or churches, monasteries around China seem to have closed, disappeared. We hear nothing more about them. And so that ends the first wave of Chinese mission work. We have 3 more in the modern period, but in between today we want to talk about the Yelikowen Jiao. So Jing Jiao, if you remember, means the luminous religion. Yelikowen Jiao means the Yelikowen religion. And nobody quite knows what Yelikowen means. Nobody's figured that out yet, but we know it refers to the Christians during the period from about 900 to 1300. And especially the last part of that period, the word Yelikowen was being used very widely in China for Christians. So it's the same sort of Christianity, the Yelikowen, where we have missionaries coming from the Middle East with the Syriac language, converting people and bringing them to faith. But at the tail end of our period, we're also going to have the first few Catholic missionaries coming. Franciscans and Dominicans coming down the Silk Road into China, along with other traders like Marco Polo. So all through this period, Christians continue to grow, Christian churches continue to be planted along that Silk Road that connected the Middle East with China. And the Syriac Church of the East, as they called themselves, was a real mission-minded church. We know they had planted churches in India, and they continued to plant them throughout what today is Central Asia. A place where, unless you're really a geography buff, or have watched, what's the name of the little girl who goes off and exploring geography on, what? Dora, yes. Unless you follow her incessantly, you probably don't know very much about Central Asia. It's that area with all the stands. Afghanistan we know about because of recent political history, but what do you know about Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, those other stands that are kind of below Russia, above India, and a little bit west of the Middle East? That's Central Asia, and that's where the Silk Road went, right through the middle of that to China. And all along the way, Christian churches popped up. And you see this writing here. It looks a little bit like Arabic, a little bit like Hebrew, and a little bit like Syriac. It's Sogdian. We mentioned the Sogdians before. If you remember, I showed one picture of a guy on a camel with a big beard and a hat. He was the Sogdian. Well, here's a Sogdian Christian manuscript from the 7th or 8th century from along the Silk Road. These missionaries went along and planted churches in a whole bunch of other cultures, and most of these we don't know much about because only a few scraps of evidence have survived. But in many of the places, the people never knew how to write before. Literacy was not something that was common or part of their culture. And so the Syriac people wrote down, the missionaries wrote down the language for the first time, something that's still happening today. You know about Lutheran Bible translators and Wycliffe Bible translators who go all over the world translating the Bible into cultures, small Aboriginal cultures, where often they've never had literacy before. And so what's one of the first things the missionaries do? Figure out how to write down the language into some sort of script so that they can translate the Bible and teach people how to read and write. Our missionaries like Opleger way back when did this for Apache. It was Lutheran missionaries who helped write down the Apache language for the first time to help translate the Bible. Well, this happened all along the Silk Road, and we know at least a half a dozen different languages that have this Syriac-looking script because these early missionaries helped write down the language for the first time in their culture. So, 845, the Tang Dynasty is on its last legs. It'll last a little longer, but be weaker and weaker. It's replaced in China by the Song Dynasty, S-O-N-G, easy to remember. First, we have what's usually called the Northern Song because it reached all the way up to the north quite a bit. This is followed when they get pushed back down to the south by the Song dynasty for a couple centuries, for about a century and a half. And why are they getting bigger or smaller? Because war is constantly going on, and you have lots of other people like the Liao people from the Korean area, the Western Xia people from Central Asia, and a lot of Turkic tribes. What we know as the Turks come from Central Asia, and in about the year 1000, they are getting bigger and bigger, and they divide. Some of them go west and end up in what's now known as Turkey, and then other ones go east and end up in Central Asia and become part of the Mongolian peoples. So between 900 and 1200, we have a huge conglomeration of different peoples and tribes all over Central Asia. But what's interesting is that a number of them, the Naaman, the Karaite, the Merkits, you probably don't remember this from high school history because I had never heard of any of these until I started studying these. But these little tribes became partially Christian due to the work of these Syriac missionaries. And even the Uyghurs, now that name may ring a bell. Anybody hear that name before? Yep. The Uyghurs. And what are they famous for? Or infamous?
Well, they're being persecuted by the main Chinese government.
Because right now there's millions of them in re-education camps in northwest China. These people became Christian, many of the Uyghur, in the 10th century and 11th century. Later, they're going to become Muslim, and that's why they're being persecuted today, because the Chinese are afraid they're going to become Muslim extremists, so they're trying to get rid of their Muslimness in the meantime with re-education. But in our period here, they are becoming Christian, many of them. So at the same time, just about the time the Tang Dynasty falls and Christianity is prohibited in the main part of China, new mission groups, new groups of Christians are springing up to the northwest of China, and this is going to get Christianity right back into China. This will not be on the final test, these names, the Karaite, the Naaman, or the Merkit, so don't worry about it. But just be aware that there were a number of important tribes there. And the Karaite chief becomes a patron to a young guy named Genghis Khan, which some of you may have heard of. And Karaite women who were Christians intermarry into the royal family. Genghis Khan is one of these young Turkic Mongol tribal chiefs who starts really feeling his oats and starts going around conquering other tribes, and pretty soon is the chief of a huge conglomeration of Turkic tribes, bringing them all together. And a number of these, he intermarries. He has numerous wives, but one of them is Christian from one of these other tribes. He marries himself into the royal families, just like the European monarchs did, have these cross national marriages among the kings and the queens. They did the same things among the Mongols. And so pretty soon we have Christian women who are married to important leaders in this whole movement. And then Genghis Khan keeps expanding, and his successors too. And so we get what's called the Mongol Empire at the beginning of the 13th century. And then after Genghis, his grandkids kind of split things up again after at one time having this much territory. Notice it now is including basically all of China. But the China part breaks off or is under one ruler and becomes known as the Yuan dynasty. So they take over and it's Mongol people in control, but they say, hey, if we're going to rule here in China, we're going to have to act Chinese and learn to live Chinese, because this is an old culture and they're not going to, you know, we've got a few things to learn from them, but if we really want to rule successfully, we're going to have to fit in somehow. So they declare themselves a dynasty, just like all the other Chinese dynasties, and they give it the name the Yuan dynasty. And notice it's going to last almost 100 years. What do you think Chinese people are going to feel about this? You think these Mongols are really going to fit in? Yeah, no, it ain't going to work very well. So that's one of the reasons it doesn't last longer than this. But for a while it seems to have happened. Now, how do we know about all these things? Well, from different historical records. But one of the interesting things is all the way through Central Asia we find little gravestones like this one, a very crudely carved memorial on a big stone. But what do you see right in the middle of it? Cross. And the cross is found again and again. And then around the edge of it, we get Syriac writing, and sometimes other scripts besides. And then we get an inscription, if you translate it, something like the year 1578, the year of the rabbit. This is the tomb of Periodoit Shah Malik, the son of Gewargis Altuz. Very simple funerary description. What date do we have there? 1578. You're out in the middle of Central Asia. What could the date 1578 go back to? (1578 years after). Great guess, but no, not the Buddha. I didn't expect anybody to get this answer. Ottoman? Nope, the Ottoman Empire starts about 1200, so it would be about 300 on this one, or 200 maybe on this one if you did that. It goes back to the beginning of the Seleucid Empire, which was started by one of the generals of Alexander the Great. Remember, Alexander the Great conquers all the way to India. When he dies very young, his three generals divide things up, and one of them is named Seleucus, who takes over all the way to Central Asia and he actually founds the city of Antioch, where it sent out Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. But all the way back there, this part of the world starts dating things from the beginning of there, and here we have 1,500 years later, some Mongolians out in the middle of nowhere in Central Asia are still using this dating system that goes back 1,500 years. But at the same time, they're also using what dating system? The year of the rabbit. You can see the same sort of animal zodiac system that China used was used by other groups there. And then that name, Periodoit Shah Malik. Shah Malik sounds very Persian, the Shah of Persia, and Malik. Gewargis Altuz. So you've got about 3 or 4 different cultures represented in this one tombstone that we just happened to find out in the middle of nowhere in Central Asia. And when I say out in the middle of nowhere, I mean probably 50 miles from the nearest village out in the steppe country where this person happened to die. So we have a huge multicultural situation. One of the things you learn if you're a history professor is when people talk about racial purity, they should have their heads examined, because there is no such thing. If we think in modern times we start having some intermarriages and things like this, this has been going on for 1,000 years, and none of our ancestors was anything close to racially pure, no matter what our background is. And that's all just propaganda that politicians play with to try to get people to fight against each other or fight for them. This kind of thing doesn't exist. And of course, for us Christians, it's a wonderful thing. It reminds us once again that when we're all around the throne in heaven, it's we're all the jokes about the Wells people being over in this corner of heaven, and be quiet when we go by there because they think they're the only ones here, Yes, those are fun jokes and everything, but we know a lot better, don't we? That all these people from around the world are going to be there, and along with Shah Malik. I'll be very interested to talk to him once we get up to heaven to find out really more about him. More and more of these stones have been discovered. They were discovered through the last couple hundred years and documented by archaeologists. It's been very difficult to kind of trace the history of this because these stans have gone back and forth between a lot of different political powers. And if you really want to read the early archaeologist reports, many of them are in Russian, and then you have some in Chinese, and you have some in Mongolian, and so forth. So it's a really difficult thing to study. And then these stones move around from museum to museum. But here are a couple Americans who, they're both Baptist missionaries, actually, who live in Central Asia, where it's illegal to be a missionary. So they both have day jobs, but in their free time, they work with local churches, etc. But one of their day jobs is becoming archaeologists now to study these new Christian remains. And they have helped find some new stones, like this one on the left that has been recently found in Kazakhstan.
Where do they find these? I mean, they don't just go out digging for them.
Farmers are plowing in their fields, and their plow hits something, and they uncover it, and here's a big stone sitting there. Or somebody's out hiking, and they notice that this stone has some scratches on it, and so forth. So it's pretty much hit and miss. However, they have found a couple monasteries and churches, and then nearby graves. So one of the places we visited when I was along the Silk Road a year and a half ago in Samarkand, they took us out to, and I have a picture here of one of the churches we visited, where they've had at least 20 different Christian grave sites that were found, and with most of those there is a small stone of some sort with a cross and sometimes a name on it.
What is the size of this stone? Like, what is the scale?
This one is about this big. Okay. Some are a little bigger and some are smaller, but I'd say, kind of medium-sized stones for the most part.
The only religion that used the cross as a symbol?
Good question. Christianity was the only religion that used it, I think, consistently. Manichaeism was actually a kind of an offshoot of Christianity, depending on which scholar you want to believe, that came out of Persia. And they also talked about Jesus and used Christian symbols, etc. But, and they spread into China as well to some extent, but they were never as numerous. But as far as I know, they're the only ones that really adopted the cross as such, as a kind of more of an official symbol. We'll get back to that in just a little bit because I have some pictures of some other ones. So at the same time all this was happening in northwest China, in southeast China, we also had Christians coming in. And again, along the seacoast, these were where the Christian missionaries, instead of going across the Silk Road, sailed around India and around all the way into the China Sea and docked in the southern fort along Fujian, what's now called Fujian province, opposite Taiwan on the coast. And we have here Christian gravestones that have been found too, a few dozen, not as many, but one or two, especially in the port cities, is where they were found. And what do you notice about this one? You see the cross again, very obviously Christian, but what about that person beneath there? What does that look like? Holding a cross, but looks like very much kind of a Buddhist position, doesn't it? Somebody sitting there with their legs crossed and everything. That's one reason I could never be a Buddhist anyway, because I can't sit that way. But here's a typical gravestone we find down there, and that is down in this area here, Quanzhou. And here's a map that shows you all the different places where we know Christians existed during this period. So a much wider area, and pretty much all over China. Now, if you say, well, they're especially along the Silk Road, which is the green there. I'm not even going to try to do that. And there's none in here, but this is all mountains and desert. So 90% of today's population, like 90% of ancient population in China, lived along the southern coast and the eastern coast up here. And the rest of the dots there are basically all along the Silk Road, with not very many off the beaten path. Here's another gravestone from the southwest. I blew it up a little too big, but again, this one has Syriac writing on it. Here's one. Who knows what Fogspa language is? All these trick questions today, sorry. Yeah, that doesn't look like anything you've seen before, huh? Fogspa is the earliest predecessor of Esperanto. And any of you remember Esperanto? Yes, it's kind of artificial language people were trying to conduct to kind of meld all the other languages and make it one universal language to do. The Mongol Empire in China had so many different peoples under it that it tried to do the same thing. It created an artificial language, Fogspa, that was going to be used, and guess what? It worked about as good as Esperanto. Nobody ended up using it, but we have some examples of it among this beautiful Christian gravestone. And here's one in Chinese, which says, set up by the prior of the Mar Antonius of the Xingming Monastery of the Yelikuan of the various districts of Quanzhou. So here notice we have the word Yelikuan, which tells us this was set up for the head of a monastery who died in this southeastern city of Quanzhou. Now, as Christianity spread through along the Silk Road into China, we find out about it also through the reports of Western travelers, because as the Silk Road got more and more, was able to be used more and more by Europeans. But what was happening? We also have these Mongol hordes and others coming in and threatening Europe, right? The Muslims in particular, the Westerners had just been defeated in the Crusades time and time again, and they were looking for allies. So we actually have, after the Golden Horde invades Europe, Pope Innocent sends a Franciscan monk to the Mongol court, and they're going to actually try to make friends with the Chinese or the Mongol emperors to see if they can get unite with them to fight against the Muslims, because at this time the Mongols are not Muslim yet. They have their own Mongolian religion, but Genghis Khan was actually very open to religions. His idea was let everybody have their own religion as long as you pay your taxes and follow orders. You're part of my empire. You can believe whatever you want. And we know that he actually, as I said, had Christian wives, married his sons to Christian women on occasion, and so forth. So he had nothing against it, and that anytime we have religious freedom, that's an opportunity for the gospel to spread again. So some of these people, John of Plano Carpini, a Franciscan who's sent out in 1245, not so much to evangelize, but to make this treaty with the people. He gets all the way to northern Mongolia, going through Ukraine to get there, and he's present as the third great Khan. So we think of Genghis Khan as the first of the great Khans. Khan just means kind of prince or ruler, and he was the great Khan, meaning over the whole area. When he died, his successor took over, and now the third Khan is Guyuk. Guyug, lots of different ways to spell that. And when this Franciscan gets there to negotiate at the court, he finds these Nestorian Christians, these Syriac-speaking Christians, all along the way and at the court.
Question, please? Actually, two questions. When you say that was more political than missionary, what was the political goal?
Trying to unite the Mongols in a treaty with the Europeans to fight against the Muslims.
The second part of my question is, did they gain any influence, monetary influence, by being missionaries there? Was there an earthly reason why they would want to go there?
No. So was there something to gain monetarily to going there? And the answer was no. And the Franciscans are supposed to be, you know, poor brothers anyway who don't own anything. So they were going there just to, but I think if anything there was a little geographical wanderlust that was behind these people. I mean, they had to be people willing to go off and explore new areas. I think that if there was any additional goal, it was that, to try to find out more about these areas. He gets there and he says, you know, I've come from the Pope in Rome. He would like you to be one of his people under him and everything. And he gets kind of a nasty answer from Guyuk. You say that I should become a trembling Nestorian Christian, worship God and be an ascetic. How do you know whom God absolves? In truth, to whom he shows mercy. So notice the Mongolian emperor didn't see any difference between this Franciscan missionary coming in and the other Christians who were already there in his court, the Nestorians. And he says, oh, you want to make me a Christian, a Nestorian. Actually, John and the early Catholic missionaries were a little suspicious of these Nestorian Christians. Are they really Christians or not? They worship in this other language. They have different liturgies, different cultic practices. So are they the same as us or not? The Christians are debating this among themselves, but the emperor and the outsiders, they see them as all one, as Christians. But he says, hey, look, I ruled 2/3 of the world. I don't know who this Pope guy is you're talking about, but why are you telling me that you know who the true God is and that I don't? Not exactly the most, so he orders the Pope to come and serve him, puts it on the other shoe, and if you do not observe God's command, and if you ignore my command, I will know that you are my enemy. So not what we would call a very successful diplomatic mission here. But the Pope isn't going to give up. One Pope after another keeps sending more people. William of Rubruck goes along. He gets all the way into central Mongolia and again gets there when a new Khan is being inaugurated, this guy named Monke. And he left us his diary, his travel journal from his trip. And this is one of the earliest accurate descriptions of this Central Asia and Mongolian culture that we have, is the diary of William of Rubruck. And he talks too about all the Nestorian Christians he found around the court. And he talks about the Uyghurs, the Naamans, the Karaites, the Merkit tribes being Christian. And the head of the great Khans on one rainy day said, okay, you know, we got nothing to do today. We can't go hunting. We can't go plundering any place. Let's have a debate. So, and he asked the Manichaeans and the Buddhists and the Christians all to send their people up to have a big religious debate in front of him. So he was a very curious thing, and we know that this happened under several of the different Khans. They realized the difference between the different religions and were very interested in hearing them debate each other about the truth. And then we have this interesting incident where William says, when Easter was approaching, I was watching closely the way the Nestorians celebrated Mass and was very troubled about what I should do, whether I should receive the sacrament from them or celebrate in their vestments with their chalice and on their altar, or whether I should not take the sacrament from them. So again, Nestorian, remember where that name came from? The bishop of Constantinople, who was excommunicated for falsely teaching about the two natures of Christ. His followers move into Central Asia, or into the Middle East, outside the Roman Empire, and they are kind of absorbed into the Church of the East, the Syriac Church. But the Westerners then start calling the Church of the East, the Syriac Church, Nestorian, a dirty name, a heretical name. So they use this bad name for them, and I always put it in quotation marks because one of the things we modern scholars are trying to do is get rid of that name when we're talking about this Syriac-speaking church, which still exists today, because as far as we know, they didn't teach what Nestorius taught. So this was just a label that the Western missionaries and others put on them. So as soon as he gets over to China and he sees these Syriac-speaking people over there, what's he do? He calls them Nestorians. But notice what it tells us again about church fellowship issues. They were big. Easter's coming. What do? I'm here in the middle of China. And Easter, the biggest holiday of the year, it's when you really want to celebrate. But what do? Can I go to their church and celebrate with them, take communion from them? Can I ask to borrow their church and their robes and their chalice so I can do it on my own private service? What should I do? And this really bothers him, and he has a whole page or two on this in his diary. And so these kind of interesting things shows us the complications that exist here, but it also, I'm using it here just to show that, again, this kind of information tells us that there's Nestorian Christians all over, right at the top of the heap here. Now, this is also the period when Marco Polo comes along, and we all have heard of him, though it's really, there's, I don't know, they had a TV show a few years back called Did Marco Polo Really Go to China? People have questioned that. He actually was in prison in Europe when he dictated his adventures, the adventures or his travels, to his cellmate who published them, and it's historically it's a huge problem to try to trace down. We have several different versions, which one is original and so forth. But I'm totally convinced he actually went. There's no doubt about that, because he just knew stuff that other people wouldn't know. And what does he find in his journal? He finds Christians all along the way. The first time he went, he came back and he was asked to send more missionaries. Now, who asked him to do that? Well, he says it was the government, but I'm not quite so sure about that part of it. So he comes back with some Dominican monks. They turn back, but he goes on and goes all the way around, and he ends up spending 25 years there in China, and he gives us his account later. And again, every major city he goes to, he finds Christians. Now, we wouldn't know this if it wasn't for this kind of accidental evidence that he gives. And some people question this, but we have just enough evidence from Chinese documents to know that this is true. And we know that during this period, the Chinese government set up a special agency to oversee the Christians. They had already agencies like that for the Buddhists and other religions, the Taoists. But now they set one up for Christians, which just again tells us that they were enough of them around by this time where they thought they had to be supervised. And they put Christians in charge of the government office to oversee the other Christians. They just wanted to make sure everything was being done properly and there weren't any issues. He also speaks of several other kinds of missionaries. He talks again and again about the Nestorians, using that name, the Syriac-speaking ones, but he also finds Jacobite and Armenian Christians from other sects, other branches of Christianity from the Middle East. So Christianity is spread much wider than we would have ever expected if we did not have this kind of information. Now, just while he is in China, 1271 to 1295, somebody is going the other direction back to the Middle East. And this is one of the most remarkable stories. And again, we have it because the traveler kept a diary that still exists in Syriac. And so we have two monks from the Angut tribe, one of these tribes of Turkic people, that's their background, and they're living up near Beijing. One's a teacher and one's a younger student who goes to study under the monk, the teacher, and they hit it off and everything, and they said, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could go back and see the places where Jesus walked? Okay, we want to go take that tour back to the Holy Land to see the sacred places. Well, they couldn't just get on a plane. What did they have to do? They walked. They had to get official permission. They got it from their church officials who said, great, since you're going that way, here we'll give you some letters of safe conduct, and here's some letters to give our statistics to give back to the home office back there once you get back to Seleucia Ctesiphon. And then the local government did the same thing. They said, okay, take these and hand them off, because not a lot of travelers would go there. And here they are, and we have the talk about how they went down and how they stopped and got help from different Christians along the way, all the way through Central Asia, and then they get back here to headquarters, which is near modern Baghdad. And they hand over the letters and so forth, and then they start heading to Palestine, but they can't get there because there's war going on. So they're very disappointed. They go back to Baghdad, to church headquarters, and get ready to head back home, and suddenly the head of the entire church body, the Church of the East, the patriarch, dies. Now, before he died, he had appointed one of these two guys, Mark, to be the new archbishop for China. So Mark is getting ready to go back to take up his new duties back in China, but now he's got to wait. They have to have the burial ceremony, and then after that they have to elect a new patriarch, a new head. And since he's an archbishop, he gets to vote. But guess what happens? He himself is elected the new patriarch. Can you imagine this? Two Chinese monks dressed like Chinese monks, going all the way back to the Middle East, and then one of them gets elected to be the new head of the entire church body that spans this whole area. And he ends up taking on the name Yabalaha, which is the name of other famous patriarchs, Yabalaha III, and he rules the entire Church of the East, is the president of there for some 35, 40 years. Now, if you remember, one of the criticisms that got me started in this whole area of research was these people who saying that the early Christians in China kind of gave up the gospel and added in Buddhism and Taoism into this beautiful eclectic religion. Would somebody who is half Buddhist and half Taoist get elected to be president of your church body? I don't think so. The fact that this foreigner comes in and impresses everybody so much that they elect him president must really have shown that, you know, he wasn't any sort of space cadet theologically, but even culturally, that there was enough commonality where they expected him to be able to take over and rule this entire church body, which is exactly what he did. But that's not the end of the story yet, because what about that second monk who went along? Well, his boss, or his elder, is now the head of the whole church body, and he says, hey, I got a job for you. You can't go back yet either. I'm going to send you as my official emissary to pay respects to other people, and he sends him on to meet with the emperor in Constantinople, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, then over to Italy to meet the Pope. Unfortunately, the Pope dies again. Every time these guys show up in town, somebody dies, it seems. But then he continues further west, and he actually meets with Edward I of England, Philip the Fair, the King of France, taking greetings from the Church of the East, etc. And remember, these European leaders were very interested in trying to get some sort of rapport and alliance with these Mongols and other people. So he was kind of there as somebody who might tell them about what's happening back in the Middle East. But here, can you imagine, again, this monk starting in Beijing and ending up in the year about 1288, standing in front of two, not one, but two kings of Western European countries. Talk about cross-cultural travel and initiative and everything else, but again, the way he was treated. When he got back to Rome, he was able to celebrate his religion, in Syriac, right there in Rome. He was accepted, again, as a Christian all along the way. So we often, in church history, emphasize how the Eastern Church and the Western Church kind of grew apart, and they were at each other's throats. But here we have a typical example of where a guy from the Syriac Church is welcomed in Constantinople by the Greek Church, is welcomed by the Latin Church as a Christian brother. So, fascinating story of this kind of thing. Just one or two other closing stories. One is Prince George. Have any of you ever heard of Prester John? Who's Prester John?
He's a kind of a make-believe guy. He never truly existed during the Crusades. He was kind of seen as this Far East Christian king that would come in and help the Crusaders.
Okay. He comes in a lot of modern novels, H. Rider Haggard, Alan Quatermain novels and stuff. So this is this mythical Christian king in a far-off, distant area. And Prester is probably a corruption of presbyter or priest, but it could also be prince. And actually, this whole legend starts at this point and is probably talking perhaps about this guy, Prince George, who was an Angut prince who ends up, he's a Nestorian Christian, but his father had been loyal to Genghis and given his daughter to marry him. He's well versed in the Confucian classics, so a well-educated Chinese, but he's also a Christian. But when John of Montecorvino, a Catholic monk, comes and starts in 1294 building up the first Catholic congregation, he converts this Prince George to become a Catholic. But unfortunately, Prince George gets involved in not a coup attempt, but some political shenanigans. He ends up getting killed quite early. And as soon as that happens, he and his family, the rest of his family, reconvert to Nestorianism again. But John of Montecorvino actually builds the first Catholic church in China in the year 1299. So one of these guys already does this. And For a while, we have a small Catholic presence, 6,000 converts, etc. Training boys to do the liturgy in Latin, so they weren't all that great cross-culturally at this time. You had to do everything in Latin. And he's the one who tells us that his brothers, who were stubborn in the errors of Nestorius, perverted all those whom Prince George had converted and brought them back to their former state of schism. In other words, he brought them back into the Nestorian church and away from our good Catholic church again. We actually have the tomb now that's been discovered of Prince George in Hebei in northern China. But here we have probably the legend starting about this Christian ruler far away who is defending Christians. The Yellow River, the big river in the north, has this big loop in it, and that area is called the Ordos. And in this area, we found dozens of, or hundreds of crosses. These are all about this big. And were they ornaments? Were they belt buckles? Nobody's quite sure. They have a little loop on the back of many of them. Everyone is different. And there's been about 2,000 of them that have been discovered. Half of them are in the University Museum in Hong Kong. And you can see the Christian motifs on all of them, right? But what else do you see? Those are not swastikas, even though that's what we remember that symbol as, but these are Hindu symbols, or they can also be used in Buddhist culture. So we have a mix of things, and people don't know how to quite interpret these often. Some of them don't look like crosses at all, but the vast majority have some sort of cross shape to them. And I think very much they are, the cross ones are evidence of Christianity. But what would we expect where Christianity comes into a traditional culture? Does everybody become a Christian? No. So people who are Taoist and Buddhist and other things are going to have their own, and they might use symbols like this, and it's exactly what we should expect. But the ones that are crosses, we should expect that those are also Christian symbols, because that's exactly what we see on the gravestones, etc.
Down at the bottom, there's a fish. Did the fish symbol make its way east? Did that ever become popular?
No. It doesn't. Yeah, the fish symbol is a little bit overblown in church history. It never was that popular, a Christian symbol, but it's also an abbreviation of a Greek word, of Greek words. And so in the Syriac church, some people have argued this, that some early Chinese gravestones that have fish on it refers to Christianity, but it's an acronym that comes from Greek, and here we would need an acronym from Syriac to make any sense here. So the fish never becomes a symbol, except fish and bread together for the feeding of the 5,000. That would, if we had those two things together, then we might have a Christian symbol. Yeah, here's one of these monasteries that have been excavated, and we saw at least 20 things from there. But just to end, Christianity declined a second time at the end of the thing. It looked like things were going pretty good for the little Catholic group, but they just lost, it was too far. They just couldn't replenish their missionaries. And when the Mongols were defeated and a new Chinese dynasty came along, the Ming dynasty, Catholic and Nestorian Christianity both declined rather rapidly and kind of disappear. Again, we don't have the whole story, but if you remember, a lot of the Nestorian Christians were people in the government who were intermarried with high officials and things like this. So that's a blessing when things are going good. But when the government changes, guess what? That Christianity is then associated with the old government not looked on with favor by the new government. The new government is the Chinese one. The old one, if you remember, were those foreigners, those Mongolians anyway. Nobody was really happy with them. So again, Christianity kind of lost face because of the change in political power, and that probably ensured that it would die out again. So by the year 1400, this brand of Christianity seems to be just about erased. We have no historical account of it again. And when 200 years later, the new Jesuit missionaries would come along in the 1570s, 1580s, 1600, they looked all around because they had read William of Rubek's diary. They had read Marco Polo. They knew that there were Christians around, and they looked all over, and they couldn't find any. It seems to have died out, but that prepared the way for the next and final king. So a few implications for today from this whole study. Christianity did come to China 1,500 years ago. We saw last week preaching the gospel in a new culture is not easy. It's always tough. Missionaries have to make tough decisions on how to communicate things. Putting the scripture in the language of the local people is important. Syriac continues to be used. We don't have any bits of scripture in Chinese that have survived. So we don't know if they really translated the books of the Bible into Chinese. If not, that might be one reason why it died out so quickly. That seems to have happened again and again. Political patronage has its effects. So when the government is good to the church, that can be a positive thing. But if you get too closely aligned with the government and things go south, then that's going to affect your church as well. Christianity is no more foreign to China than other religions. It's been there numerous times under numerous different forms, and it can belong there. The gospel always produces fruit. And so I'm looking forward again to visiting with Alopen someday. But the gospel's shower may also be temporary. Martin Luther talked about the gospel as a shower. It's here today, but then the cloud moves on and it's showering some other part of the world. And you're never quite sure how long it's going to last. So that's why we have to work while it is day and always take the advantage of the gospel when we have the chance to hear it and when we have the chance to share it. I see this so much in my own life. There are parts of the world where I can't go right now as a missionary, where I could have gone 30 years ago. And hopefully new places will open up. China again was open the last 20, 25 years, but now it seems to be shutting again for outsiders to help spread the gospel. So we have to work while it's day, but when we do work, we know the gospel always produces fruit. Any final questions? Thank you so much for staying through 3 weeks. History is not the most popular subject in school for most people anymore, but it really does have some fascinating stories. And what's the name of the new missionary you learned? Alopen. Again, Alopen. Remember him? And thank the Lord for the work that he and his colleagues did 1,500 years ago, and continue to pray for everyone who is spreading the gospel in China and among the Chinese people yet today. Let's end with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, you are the Lord of the universe. You are the Lord who cares for everyone, no matter what their ethnic or linguistic or cultural background is. We know that you want all people around your throne. We thank you for all of those who have gone before us, who have participated in that work of spreading the gospel. We ask your blessing upon all those who continue to do it today, and help give us courage and opportunity so we too can share your gospel with those around us. We do this in the name of our Savior, Jesus. Amen. Thank you. And And again, if you want to learn more about this, my book is available on Amazon or at the table over here. And if you want to learn a little bit about more modern Christianity in China, my other book is available on Amazon as well.